Welcome to Clue Trail, the path through history's darkest crimes and strangest mysteries. In Vienna, during the 1980s, a hospital was meant to be a place of healing, a place where the elderly and vulnerable could receive care. But at Lainz General Hospital, a group of nurses were ending lives, not saving them. Over 6 years, dozens of patients died in their care. This is the story of the Lainz Angels of Death. In the 1980s, Austria was seen as one of Europe's safest and most stable democracies. The Cold War still divided the continent, but Vienna stood at the crossroads of East and West as a neutral capital that prided itself on order, prosperity, and social care. Austria had a strong social welfare model, with hospitals and care homes largely state-run. Families placed their trust in these institutions, especially when it came to the elderly and chronically ill. Once their loved ones were admitted, it was assumed that they would be looked after until the natural end of their lives. One of the most important facilities in this system was the Lainz Hospital. Built in 1904 on the edge of Vienna's 13th district, it was originally designed as a vast home for the elderly. By the 1980s, it had grown into a sprawling complex of long pavilions and wards with more than 1,500 beds and 14 specialist departments. It housed some of Vienna's frailest residents, the elderly, the chronically sick, and those with no family able to care for them. Conditions inside were typical of large geriatric centers of the time. Many patients shared communal rooms. Staffing was a mix of qualified nurses, assistants, and auxiliary aides who helped with daily needs such as feeding, bathing, and distributing medication. To the outside world and the families that put their trust in this institution, Lainz was a respected place where they could turn to when home care was no longer possible. Yet, behind those walls, that very trust was about to be betrayed in the most devastating way. The women who would later be called the Lainz Angels of Death were 4 auxiliary nurses. Within the hospital system, auxiliary nurses formed the base of the care structure. Doctors oversaw diagnosis and treatment plans, and registered nurses managed medication, monitored conditions, and coordinated with medical teams. But it was the auxiliary nurses who handled most of the practical hour-to-hour work that kept the ward functioning. They helped patients with washing and dressing, changed bedding and delivered meals, and made sure that those who could no longer care for themselves retained some comfort and dignity. They also supported simple medical tasks within their training, such as taking temperatures or blood pressure, recording basic observations, and keeping the ward organized. At Lainz, especially on night shifts, when staffing was thin and doctors were rarely present, auxiliary nurses were often the first to respond to a patient's needs. They knew everything about the ward, the habits of the patients, and the small changes that signaled when someone needed attention. And amongst the staff working those long nights at Lainz were 4 women whose names would later become central to the case. One of them was Waltraud Wagner, who was 23 years old in 1983 when the killings began. She had trained as a nurse's aide and joined Lainz as a junior member of the staff. At first, she was considered diligent by her colleagues and supervisors, just a young woman from a modest background, eager to make her own way in the world. But later, once more established in the job, her colleagues recalled hearing more and more about her frustrations, especially the endless repetition of feeding, cleaning, and comforting patients with little recognition from doctors or supervisors. It was her who would later admit to being the first to cross the line from care to killing. Working alongside her was Maria Gruber, the youngest of the group at just 19. She was known as soft-spoken and shy, someone who had entered nursing more for stable work than a sense of vocation. People who knew her outside the hospital described her as insecure, easily influenced, and eager to belong. Within the group, she tended to follow the lead of others rather than take initiative herself. There was also Irene Leidolf, in her early 20s and in many ways the most dominant personality. She was often described as outspoken, strong-willed, and inclined to impose her views, and no doubt someone who would encourage the others and helped ensure their pact held together. And lastly, there was Stefania Meyer, the oldest at around 50. By then, she had spent much of her life in and around hospitals and was seen as a steadying figure, someone who brought a sense of authority and experience to the younger women. Together, on those night shifts, as they shared their frustration and the strain of an overwhelming workload, the 4 women formed an unlikely alliance. And little by little, their responsibility toward the fair care of others began to change for the worst. Possibly the repetition of tasks and the constant demands of tending to patients who were severely ill or unable to help themselves may have worn them down, and they started to mistreat the patients. By the 1980s, the 4 women were no longer simply just colleagues sharing duties. They had become a close-knit group who moved from bending the rules to ending lives. The first victim in 1983, according to Volschut's later confession, was a patient she believed was suffering greatly and was beyond any help. So she decided to give that man a little dose of morphine. She said the death looked peaceful, and she felt a sense of control that stayed with her long after, justifying this cruel death as an act of mercy. For a while, she decided not to tell anyone, but the fact that nothing was questioned in regards to his death, and quite sure now that actually killing someone was simple to hide, gave her some confidence. Eventually, she shared what she had done with Irene, and surprisingly to her, instead of reacting with shock, Irene agreed with her insane reasoning, and soon they were discussing which patients might, in their own words, be better off dead. When Maria Gruber and Stefania Meyer were brought into these conversations, the group became more united than ever, and by the end of 1983, the 4 women had moved from caring for patients to deciding when those patients should die. From there, the deaths continued. Together, the 4 began using methods that could be hidden as simple routines in a geriatric ward, such as giving insulin to patients. But instead of giving insulin to diabetic patients, they would inject the ones who were not diabetic, causing their blood sugar to fall sharply until they slipped into a fatal decline. They also used sedatives such as Rohypnol to keep patients quiet, and they carried out what they called water cure, where one held a patient's nose while another poured water into the patient's mouth, causing drowning that could later look like fluid in the lungs from illness. This agonizing process could take 45 to 60 minutes for the victim to die. And in a ward where many patients were elderly and frail, sudden deaths were not unusual. Between 1983 and 1989, the 4 women confessed to killing up to 49 patients, though investigators later suggested the true number may have been much higher, possibly into the hundreds. Most victims were elderly or chronically ill, and their names were never publicly released, partially out of respect for privacy and partially due to the incomplete records and being unable to clearly determine which one was a natural death and which one was at the hands of these women. Finally, the truth of what was happening in those night shifts came slowly to light in 1989 and almost by accident. During a night shift in Pavilion 5, a non-diabetic patient suddenly fell into a coma. Tests revealed he had been given insulin and his blood sugar was dangerously low. But he survived. And this unexpected recovery finally forced the medical staff to look more closely at what had happened. So, first step, they started to look at who was looking after this patient when he fell into a coma. And as Volchad was the one on duty that night, and combined with the fact that other nurses often recall her speaking too casually about death and even making comments about ending suffering, she quickly turned into the main suspect. But what the hospital first assumed might be a simple case of a nurse not giving proper care, maybe a misjudgment caused by fatigue and the heavy demands of night work, turned out to be something far more serious. Police were called when the circumstances around the patient's care came to light, and at first, much like the hospital, investigators considered the possibility of a simple medication mistake. But that view shifted as soon as they questioned Volchad. Under pressure, she admitted not only to giving insulin to the patient who survived, but also to many other deaths over the years. And then came something no one expected. She said she had not acted alone. She named Irene, Maria, and Stefania as her partners in the killings. And as police continued interviewing the women, the full extent of the case began to appear when they all described their use of insulin, morphine, and the drowning method, with Volchad herself claiming she has killed around 40 people. And although it might have seemed unbelievable to the investigators that 4 nurses, trusted with the care of so many patients, could be capable of such crimes, Their view changed when they compared the women's statement with hospital records and found details that matched a series of sudden deaths. At that point, they knew they had uncovered the true scale of what had been happening on the wards. The trial of the so-called Angels of Death began in March 1991 at the Vienna Regional Court, nearly 2 years after their arrest. From the beginning, it drew huge attention, and journalists from across Europe reported on the story daily. When the 4 defendants, Waltraud, Irene, Maria, and Stefania, arrived in the courtroom, reporters noted how ordinary they looked. There were no signs of cruelty or madness in their appearance, as they expected them to appear with scales and wings to justify the cruel acts they inflicted on people for years. To the world, that made it even harder to understand. People expected the face of a monster, whatever that might look like. Instead, they were 4 ordinary women. The prosecution presented a clear picture of the events. There was a pattern of deaths on specific night shifts, confessions from the women that described each method, and hospital records matching the timing. They showed that the women had used insulin overdoses, sedatives like Rohypnol, and the drowning method. Doctors testified that the victims would have suffered terribly. One expert explained how insulin given to the non-diabetic patients shuts the body down within minutes. Another said that in the cases of drowning, lungs would later show water similar to pneumonia, hiding the real cause. Investigators read aloud the women's statements as recorded in their interrogations. Waltraud reportedly said, "They were suffering. I wanted to help them, to end it." Later, she added, "It became easy, too easy." Irene was quoted as saying, "If I have the power to help someone die, why shouldn't I?" Maria admitted, "I only did what the others did. I didn't want to be left out." And Stefania said, "I thought it was mercy. We saw so much pain." But was it mercy, or simply their way of hiding the reality of their actions behind something they believed the world might find less cruel? Prosecutors argued that these were no acts of compassion at all, but deliberate killings. They reminded the court that the nurses had even referred to difficult patients as getting a ticket to the beyond. The defense didn't have much to work with and simply claimed that the women were overworked and emotionally exhausted, insisting they believed they were sparing the elderly from pain. But the overwhelming evidence, the shift records, autopsy findings, and confessions was enough, and when the verdict came, it was no surprise. Waltraud Wagner was found guilty of 15 murders, 17 attempted murders, and 2 assaults, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Irene Leidolf also received a life sentence for 5 murders. Stefania Meyer was sentenced to 20 years and Maria Gruber to 15 years. The Lainz murders shocked Austria and forced hospitals to rethink how care was managed. After the trial, stricter oversight was introduced and night shifts were more closely supervised. Reporting rules were tightened and autopsies became routine in suspicious deaths. Training for nurses began to include ethics and end-of-life care, subjects once overlooked. The case also started a wider debate. Some blamed pressure and poor working conditions. others saw no excuse, calling it a complete loss of empathy, which it is. There is no excuse for ending someone's life. For the families, learning how their loved ones had their lives ended was deeply painful. Many never really learned for sure if their relatives were among the victims, as cremations had destroyed the evidence. The many victims who lost their lives, their final months or even years that should have been spent as comfortably as possible given their circumstances, were denied that chance. They were mothers, fathers, and grandparents who should have been safe in their hospital beds until these four monsters decided to play God. That brings us to the end of this episode of Clue Trail on the case of the Lainz Angels of Death. If you'd like to support the show and hear more stories like this, join us on Patreon for bonus episodes and extra content. You can also find us on Instagram and YouTube, and a quick rating on Apple or Spotify helps others find the trail. Thank you for listening and for walking this trail with us.